The Pension Confident podcast is excited to announce that they'll be recording a live episode on Thursday, the 4th of May at White City Place in London, and they want you to come and join the audience. Host Philippa Lamb will be joined by myself and other guests, including Financial Times consumer editor Claire Barrett, financial expert, author and TV personality Peter Komalafe, and Pension Bee's Director of Public Affairs Becky O'Connor to discuss if your money's better off in a pension or an ISA. Tickets are completely free. To get yours, visit eventbrite.co.uk and search Pension Bee to take you to the event page. Don't forget, you can also download the Pension Confident podcast wherever you listen to your podcast. So remember, that's the Pension Confident podcast live on the 4th of May at White City Place. I look forward to seeing you there.
Hello and welcome to the first of a series of bonus podcast episodes on the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert, as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leeks. Damien, we're back. We've had a week off. In fact, I know we've had a week off because it just took me 3 goes to get the intro to the podcast.
It did, Andy, and if people don't see behind the scenes, but I'm really excited about the episode this week. It's one that's been in the making for a long time. So coincidentally, I met the person I'm interviewing today on the podcast at a panel event that Pension Bee hosted. So I was on the panel with them and I've asked them to come on the show. We finally managed to make it happen. And listeners of our podcast have been asking us to do some life event content. So things around life events that occur. And in particular, one of those is starting a family. So people who are maybe working and looking to start a family. So advice, not only just for their money, but career. So today's guest covers all of those topics. It's not just for our female listeners, it's also for our male listeners. There's a lot of content in there that I think people will get a lot from. And also if you're an employer, I really do think this show is a must listen. And before I just start off the interview, we're going to be doing a giveaway at the end. So Tobi, who I'm interviewing, has just released a book. We'll be giving away a signed copy of the book at the end of the show, where we'll give you full details of how you can enter.
Okay, so here it is then, the interview that Damien did with Tobi Asare.
Okay, so today I'm really excited to have a guest on the show who I've been trying to get on the show for quite some time. We first met in, I think it was the autumn of 2022. We did a panel event together. And so since then, well, at the time, my guest told me that she was writing a book, which I've actually now read, and it's a fantastic book. And it also coincides with a lot of the stuff we're trying to do at the moment about doing more female-orientated content. So I'm going to bring Tobi onto the show. So Tobi Asare has written a book called The Blend. So Tobi, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good morning.
How are you?
I'm really well, thank you.
I have been trying to get you on the show for some time. You've been incredibly busy because your book has only just been launched. And so for listeners, it would be great if you could give us a bit of your backstory, actually, because it's incredibly interesting, and how you eventually got to write your book, which has just been released, called The Blend.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Well, in 2018, I was on maternity leave with my first child, and I happened to be the first person in my office location to go on maternity leave. During that time, I felt like I'd built up a huge amount of success. I was incredibly ambitious. I was running a team of 40 people, which I'd grown myself. The business that I was managing, I had grown that business by 60% in that time. So lots of exciting things happening, but also having that fear of wanting to step away and have a family. During that process, I had lots of questions about how could I do this and make sure that my ambitions kind of keep soaring at the same time as kind of raising my family, and had lots of conversations with my friends and realized that I wasn't the only person that had lots of different questions about how to still navigate through your career and also build and grow your family. So I decided to do something about it, and I called it My Bump Pay, which is a platform actually originally that I started to talk about money, because let's face it, that's the big consideration that lots of us have when we kind of start or grow families. So I started My Bump Pay in 2018, and now it's really pivoted into a platform to help women smash the glass ceiling with a baby on the way and beyond. And within My Bump Pay, it's basically a content-led platform, talk about lots of things like money, confidence, going back to work, finding yourself after having a baby. And through that process, I've been really, really lucky to write about it. And now it's kind of in the formation of a book, which is wonderful, which means hopefully I get to impact many, many women and their partners on this journey to navigating their career and parenthood.
So the title of the book, which, as you said, is kind of the continuation of this journey that you're on. And talk me through the title, because I think the title is fascinating.
Yeah, the book is called The Blend, How to Successfully Manage a Career and a Family, but the real focus is the blend. So people will call it The Blend, really. And the reason why it's called The Blend is really moving away from this term called balance. Maybe it's work-life balance or family-life balance when you kind of think of family and work. Because as I was on this journey, I was searching desperately for this balance that everybody was talking to, or this Havana of this balance. But I realized we have work on, one side of our lives, maybe parenting and family life on one side of our lives. And it's really, really hard to get the two of them to kind of neatly equate on, two different sides of our lives. It can be really messy. We know parenting can be really messy. We know working can be intense, and it has moments of less so in terms of intensity. So actually, I found chasing the balance really, really difficult and perhaps detrimental to my own kind of mental health. So I like to think about it as the blend. And within the blend, you take a different mix of ingredients or elements that you need to survive, thrive, or stay sane throughout your working and your parenting journey. And sometimes there might be more ambition in your blend, and that's totally okay. And other moments there may be more family time in your blend, and that's totally okay.
So what we're going to do is, I've obviously read the book, and it's a brilliant book, and I'm going to go through some of the journey in that book, actually, because you cover so many topics. You cover things from before you become pregnant with your employers, conversations. You cover sensitive topics such as baby loss and work. You even go through to preparing for maternity leave, eventually returning to employment, starting side businesses and combining careers with family over the long term. And you even touch upon mum guilt as well towards the end of the book, which I think is an important theme. And one of them that we're going to come back to later is about confidence as well. As a whole section on that, which I think women will be able to relate to, that sort of lack of confidence at that point when it comes to your family and a career. But one of the recurring themes in the book is about intention and planning, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And listen, you can't necessarily always plan a family down to a T. Life has this wonderful way of kind of throwing us different meanders and curves and things that we have to deal with. But I think it's incumbent on us as women to realize that the pregnancy or starting a family journey is not easy when you're trying to build your career alongside that. But absolutely, if you are intentional about it, there are certainly wonderful milestones that you can hit, or you can find that actually you grow so much as a human being, you grow so much as a professional or a business owner. So by being intentional, you can still hopefully create the successes or, hit the milestones that you still want to as an individual as you're growing your career or your business and a family.
So I found the book actually inspiring. So it isn't just full of tips and advice. I actually think the whole thing was quite inspiring because there's topics in there such as mentors, etc. So there's advice really about how you can further your career even while you are pregnant. So there are things we're going to touch upon later in this chat. But I think for anybody who is listening to this, even if you're an employer or if you are a man who's listening to this podcast, you do a whole section as well later on, which I thought was a very good chapter about allies. Mm-hmm. And I love the term. So people who are the allies to helping women through this process and enabling them with their career and having a family. So it's definitely a book that's worth reading, even if you aren't directly reading it for the fact that you are about to have a baby yourself. So moving on to the first kind of area of the book, you touch upon some tips when you first join an employer, which I thought were incredibly interesting because it may be some sort of tips to do even before you even maybe thought about having a family.
Yeah, definitely. I always probably preach a bit too much, but I always say that as soon as you join any kind of employer and you think at some point in the future a family may be on the cards, and that could be 5-10 years down the line, it doesn't really matter. I think it's really, really important to have a look at what the policies say and what the benefits say, just so that you're really aware of what is on offer if you were to start a family with that employer. And I encourage both parties in a relationship, if you are going down that route in terms of starting your family, I encourage both parties in a relationship to have a look. Because the wonderful thing is that we're seeing organizations actually employ really, really great policies for men and for women, or for both partners in the relationship. So it might be that the other partner can take, 3, 4, 5, or even 6 months off that is paid, or they may have a really good, encouraging policy around shared parental leave, for example. All those things are really, really helpful to know when you're kind of starting your family or you're thinking about starting your family in the future.
And so you have some resources, don't you, on your My Bump Pay website, so that your platform, because you do things about how to create budgets and plan for the monetary impact of starting a family.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got 2 free resources on there, which I absolutely love and are very, very popular. So one of them is effectively how much would it cost to have a baby? So I've broken down as much as I possibly can, all the things that you are likely to need in the first year. And I've tiered them by different priorities. So for example, I think tier 1 is the things that you definitely need to have. So it could be things like nappies or milk, for example. And then tier 2 are things that would be nice to have. And then tier 3 is effectively the luxuries. So just by using that spreadsheet, depending on the things that you think that you may need, you can start to assess how much roughly it would potentially cost you in the first year. Now, that isn't a lump sum payment that you kind of pay out. Those are things that you might be, getting over the period of time of those particular 12 months. So that's incredibly helpful. And then the second free resource really allows you to, I call it a maternity leave calculator. So it allows you to look at what your budget is on a normal day-to-day basis outside of maternity leave. And then you can input the figures that you think you may get with your maternity pay. And you can do a number of things. You could have a look at what your budget looks like, and you can also have a look at possibly how long you could afford to take off on any kind of parental leave using that budget, because I think money is such a huge worry for so many people as they step into parenthood, and just having a few templates to help people get started on that journey to having a look at their finances during that time, I think people have found incredibly helpful.
So in the book, you also then move on to, it's not just budgeting, you then give tips about ways to boost your finances. So things like automating your savings ahead of having a baby and going on maternity leave. So, I mean, we've talked about them on the Money to the Masses podcast before, but they're things like Plum, apps like that. So we'll put links to those sorts of articles so people can find them and have a look, and cashback websites. But of course, you also mentioned things a bit more financial planning in terms of thinking about the impact on things like mortgages. So the changes in your lifestyle or your environment, you might decide you want to move house, but you're also quite realistic, aren't you, in the book about what you think you need to do versus the actual reality.
Yeah, definitely. So things like moving house, I can't remember the exact statistic. I think it's 1/5 of parents maybe move or get more space. But actually the reality is you may not need more space for the first year, for example. Babies are quite contained for that first year. They're not necessarily up and moving and running everywhere for the first year. They may be. But so I think for the first year, you can definitely probably, depending on your circumstances, maybe hold off and maybe looking at making that big move, maybe settle into life as parents and kind of see what your lifestyle looks like before you think about, oh my goodness, we've got a new baby, we've automatically got to move. The same goes for potentially even buying a car. There are lots of families or couples that feel like they may need to kind of get a car. And again, I kind of think, look at what your lifestyle looks like with a child for a couple of months to see if you need to A, get a bigger car, or B, get a car in its entirety. So I think lots of people assume because life is changing with a little one, which is wonderful, that they need to spend lots and lots of money immediately. And I definitely think, hold back, look at what your lifestyle looks like, and then see how and where you need to make the most urgent or prioritize the purchases that you need to make.
The next phase, so obviously we want to talk through different parts of the book so people can get a real flavour of the content. And one of the things in there as well is the importance of telling work right, isn't it? Because, I mean, it is a big worry for people, how they tell work. So you talk about that, don't you, as well, about sort of tips, how to do it, ways you can do it.
Yeah, definitely. I remember my first time of having that conversation at work, and you're just thinking, how do I even start this sentence? How do I even start this conversation? And hopefully it's a really happy conversation for you personally. You're sharing some really good news. So one of the things I talk about in the book is not apologizing for it, because it's something that happens. You can't necessarily avoid it in the scheme of your working professional career if it's something that you want. But I think what's really interesting in the book is I've given people a bit of a starter for 10. So a little bit of a script. If you are really stuck for where to start in terms of having that conversation, a little bit of a script that you could take, make your own, and actually use if you want to, or kind of get some inspiration from in terms of starting to have that conversation, because it's not the easiest conversation to have. It's a deeply personal one, but obviously at some point you do need to tell your employers.
And just an aside, because it is an important part of the journey, because obviously as you highlight, you need to get the timing right for qualification for maternity pay. We're not going to go into it on the podcast. You can find links to the sort of rules about when you have to tell your employer if you want to qualify for maternity pay, but again, you cover it in the book. But one thing, like you're going back to some of the conversations to have with employers, one of the things that I really like that kind of highlights the positive and proactive nature of the book, about the fact that this is a choice and something that doesn't have to be detrimental to career. You highlight being part of the solution when it comes to maternity cover.
Absolutely. I massively believe that if you are going to go on maternity leave, and very likely there'll be somebody covering your role, I think before you even have that conversation, have a think about maybe who within your organization would be a really good option to maybe come in and kind of, learn little bits of your role, maybe expand their experiences, because actually that's an opportunity for someone else to grow their own skill set, their own career, especially let's say if you are maybe mentoring somebody within that organization. And I think doing that allows you to be a little bit more in control, allows you to be part of that particular journey, and also allows you to design or have some kind of input, hopefully, on how you want to return to the organization. So I definitely think, see it as a positive. And I think lots of people kind of potentially, I get it, right, probably feel a little bit threatened about somebody else stepping in to take their role. But I think if you are part of that journey, you get to craft what that looks like, or have a big say in what that looks like. So I think if you're really proactive and bring some kind of solutions, then you're part of that, and you're not allowing others to 100% dictate what that looks like with no input.
And in one of the points in there, there's a section where you talk about smashing your career while pregnant, and one of the points about visibility as well, isn't it? You talk about that, which is linked in a way, isn't it? You're talking about the sort of things that you could do while pregnant to try and take charge of that journey, isn't it, and be in control.
Yeah, and I would say it's a really personal choice. Depends on how your pregnancy or your journey to parenthood is going. So I obviously massively appreciate that some people do not have straightforward pregnancies or straightforward routes to parenthood, and obviously that can be quite stressful in itself and potentially physically limiting. However, if you are somebody that still wants to push on with their career ambitions and their goals whilst they are still pregnant, this book definitely helps to give you the steps to absolutely do so, because it is definitely possible. We speak to a wonderful lady in the book who has done exactly that. So yeah, it's really to encourage people that if you are starting family, or if you are pregnant, it's not the end of your career. It's not the death of your career. If anything, it's just starting a new chapter. And the point about visibility that you raise, I think, is so important, encouraging people to still, stand in their role, stand in their position, take up things that will allow them to be more visible within their department or in their role if they feel that they're capable to do so. Don't feel because you're pregnant you all of a sudden have to retreat backwards and backwards until you eventually go on maternity leave. No, absolutely not. Still ambitious, go for it.
So there's a core part of the book that gives the sense it's also like careers, almost coaching in it. For example, you talk about mentoring and finding a sponsor, which I do think for a lot of people are concepts which they would be useful anyway, but I don't think many people realise the help that a mentor or sponsor can bring. Could you just highlight the sort of top level of what that part of the book was really covering?
So to break it down, a mentor typically will be somebody that can help guide you through your career, share their own experiences for you to learn from. And I found them to be fundamentally instrumental in my own career, especially as a working mum who I still work full time. I should have said that at the top, but I still work full time. So I found, mentors to be incredibly instrumental in my career as I kind of navigate through new and different seasons. The difference is that a sponsor is somebody who will effectively advocate for you, or will cheer you on, or will raise your name where there's an opportunity for you to kind of take on greater responsibility. And the difference between a mentor and a sponsor is that a sponsor effectively is somebody that usually sits in a very senior position, that sits around the tables where they're making those decisions around progression, pay and promotion and opportunities, and has good visibility of your performance, either through a relationship, a professional relationship, or through kind of more of a sponsoring relationship. And that sponsor, hopefully, through seeing your great work, when there's an opportunity to say, do you know what, Tobi's on maternity leave, but she's coming back in 2 months and she's already expressed that she would love to take on XYZ, and I've seen her results in this area, and I think she'd be absolutely fantastic for that opportunity. That's how a sponsor works, especially if potentially you're about to go on maternity leave, or if you are on maternity leave, or you're returning back to the business. I think a sponsor is vital, because whilst you're away from the business, they are there to advocate for you in a way that you can't, because potentially you're away on maternity leave.
Another part is you talk about, I found this very interesting when you talk about nailing your career during pregnancy. You start breaking it down by trimesters. So there's really different tips for each trimester. Could you give us a flavour of what some of the tips in each trimester?
So trimester 1 is getting really good clarity on your role and what success looks like. Even let's say if you are ambitious, but you're thinking, in 2 years' time, you might want to go for the next role, or you might want to go for the next promotion. It doesn't have to be necessarily in that period of your pregnancy in the workplace. But I think clarity of what's expected of you and clarity of what it takes to succeed in that role is really, really important at that particular stage, because during your first trimester, very likely you're very tired. You haven't told anyone about your pregnancy, but you probably still want to make sure that you can absolutely still perform. So by focusing on those metrics, all those things that will effectively allow you to still do a good job, I think would be really, really helpful. And then trimester 2, you're probably starting to kind of share your news. So I think a big part of trimester 2 is, like we've touched upon before, is kind of, visibility and making sure that you've got good relationships with stakeholders, and making sure that you've got a mentor, making sure that you've got a sponsor. And then trimester 3, I think, is at that stage where you're thinking about going off on maternity leave, making sure there's a really clear handover, that you've written a fantastic guide to your role. And I always say that if you feel that you've put in too much detail into your handover pack, then actually you're on the right lines, because you want to make sure that whoever steps into your role has a good opportunity of success, and actually you'll buy a lot of favor and you'll buy a lot of kudos if you're really helpful at that particular stage. So that just gives a bit of a glimpse into some of the things that you could do trimester by trimester. And I should say that, again, we've kind of noted very clearly that everyone's route to parenthood looks very, very, very different. I've just discussed it as trimesters as a way of just compartmentalizing time, so that if you're thinking about it, in terms of time, then that's how I would suggest you potentially breaking it up.
And then by the end of that, you also talk about building a maternity leave checklist, don't you?
Yes, there's a long checklist. I had to stop myself as well because for the purposes of editing and making the book interesting, you don't want to write a whole long laundry list. But there's a long checklist in the book of things that I think are really helpful to do to help prepare you. And you can just literally tick them off. Some of those things will take 2 minutes, and some of those things take a little bit more planning, but it's a very, very helpful guide.
So just to give a flavour of a couple of those on the checklist.
So some of the things on the checklist, which I think are really helpful, are just things like noting down when your performance reviews are taking place, because if they happen to fall when you are on maternity leave, I think it's a really good time to think about, do you want to be involved in that performance review? You absolutely should be involved in performance reviews whilst you are on maternity leave. So you can maybe think about using a keeping in touch day to be involved in that performance review, depending on how performance reviews take place in your organisation. And then I've just mentioned keeping in touch days, which are totally optional, but those days are an opportunity for you to stay in touch with the business, so you can do additional training, you can go in and meet new team members. But I think it's really, really powerful to think about how you want to use your keeping in touch days before you go on maternity leave, and potentially discussing those with your boss to see how they also feel about them, and try and get some kind of informal agreement at that particular stage that you can use your keeping in touch days in that way.
So of course there are other options for people out there if they return to work. Some people might decide to start a side hustle. You talk about that in the book, which is interesting. And obviously I found it fascinating, being somebody who, Money to Masses essentially was a side hustle in a career that I had in finance. You do also touch upon the reality that some people may have to search for a new role after they return from maternity leave. They might choose to. You have a diagram actually in the book that highlight some of the things that people could or potentially should look for in a new employer, so they can find somewhere where they can thrive, which I do think was a very interesting image. It's like a Venn diagram that's got about 5 or 6 circles that converge, and obviously if you're right in the middle, then you've really hit the jackpot in terms of different things. But some of those things that people could consider if they're looking for a new employer, could you just give us a flavour of some of those?
Yeah, I think it's so important, because I think these days we're less likely to spend our whole entire working life in one organisation. There's, I don't know exactly what the stats are in terms of the average length of tenure of somebody within a company or organisation. I think it might even be around 2 years or 2.5 years. So I think there's a high chance or high likelihood that somebody, as they become a parent, they're going to move to a different company. And I think making that move as a parent, I know, can be quite daunting, because you're leaving somewhere where like, even if it's a good or a bad organization, you know it very well. And you've figured out your life and your routine around kind of pickups and managing a family within that organization. Now, picking that up and moving to somewhere else can feel like a really big task. And I think some people feel like it's so big, it almost holds them back from moving on. But I found if you kind of use some of these metrics to help you judge an organization, you can hopefully find and identify somewhere where you can really thrive as a parent, which I think is fundamentally really important. So some of those things, for example, could just be empathetic leaders who listen, I'm really fortunate that I work in a business where there are lots of different people with families. We even have a female CEO who has 2 children of her own. And so actually within the organization, there's a real culture of empathy and understanding, even if you don't necessarily have a family. So people understand if you've got other commitments outside of work, music, sports, all those types of things are really encouraged. And I think as a result, I've personally been able to thrive. And I think lots of people also have been able to thrive. Not every organization has this, but also things like just having networks where you can find similar people at a similar life stage, for example, networks or engagement groups where you have working parents and carers. That I have found to be really, really helpful, because I think employees feel that they can find their people, they can find their tribe. They have people that maybe have walked the journey within that organization of starting a family and can share little tips and bits of advice. So those are just some of the things that I can say to maybe have a look out for. But I think when you get to interview stage, you can just feel it. If you're asking the right questions, you can feel if this hopefully is somewhere where you can thrive as a working parent.
And you mentioned about finding the people who walk the journey ahead of you. And I just want to highlight to people listening to this that when you sometimes get a book, it can be that you might think, oh, is it a bit preachy? These people are trying to tell me, like, can it all be in the book, given it's one person's experience and journey? But you actually do it very well by having case studies in the book. And I had highlighted some of them when I was going through and reading them, because what you do is you highlight different people at really each stage, and you pull out people who have been on that journey. There's a very good case study in the book where there's somebody, a family who I think it was 3 times did shared parental leave.
Yes.
So it is worth reading that the case studies add to the ideas that are in the book, because obviously it's like that shared kind of community spirit, which I know that's something that is at the heart of my bump pay, that community element and shared experience. So moving on, one chapter that I thought was really interesting that you had a whole chapter on this, which is confidence. So with different people that we've spoken to relating to some of the content we're doing for women, but also from our own lives and our own partners, the confidence element for women when it comes to returning to the workforce or having had a baby and going back to their same job is a real big thing, isn't it? It's a hurdle, some of the imposter syndrome that exists.
Yeah, I could have probably, if I had more time, written a lot more about the confidence topic, because it's so important. And not everybody, you can't generalize, but I think a lot of women, after having a baby and taking some time away from the workplace, and even then, when I say time away, I'm really conscious that time away is just from the workplace. I still feel that women on maternity leave are still working. They're just doing a very different kind of work, but it's still very intense work. And taking that step away from the workplace can really impact somebody's confidence, especially, let's say, if you're on a trajectory, you're doing some amazing things in your career, or your work just gives you a lot of purpose and a lot of value. Stepping away from that can be very, very daunting, not to at least to touch on all the changes that a woman kind of goes through physically and potentially even emotionally. And there's lots of research that says up to 2 years in that kind of postpartum period after you have a child, a woman often finds that they will have a dip in their confidence. The great news about that piece of research is that after 2 years, it starts to come up again. But within those 2 years, you're very likely to have gone back to work. And we all know the impact that confidence can have on how we show up, how we perform at work, how we engage at work, how we stay happy in our general life, and how that impacts lots of different other things. So it's really important that we touch upon confidence. And there's lots of tips and exercises in the book. And we speak to a brilliant psychotherapist, Anna Murtha, who's written lots and lots of books on confidence for mothers, and she kind of shares her top tip, which I'm so honoured that she would share that as part of this journey for the book.
And one tip in there which I thought was very interesting is if you buy yourself a gift.
Yeah, one of my favourite tips. But yeah, because I think as women, as parents, if whoever's taking the majority of that leave, we spend so much time focusing on raising this young, wonderful baby into the world, and it takes a lot from us. Obviously, it also gives a lot to us in terms of satisfaction and joy of obviously having a baby. But I think there's a lot of attention and a lot of focus placed on that small child and not necessarily on the mum. So I say, invest in one thing that makes you feel more confident or makes you feel special. Now, that could be cashmere socks if that's your thing. That could be a fragrance. That could be, a book. Just that one thing, I think, that makes you feel that you as an individual, you're important, that you have value, that you have something to offer to the workplace, and something that gets you a little bit more, excited, I guess, so to speak. So yeah, I think that's a great tip. Obviously, I'm biased. If you can get somebody to get that gift for you, even better.
Even better. So there's lots of other parts of the book. I mean, later on it talks about mum guilt and tips to deal with that and tips to keep you sane as a working mum. But I think it'd be quite nice to round off because one of the final chapters in the book is titled For the Allies. And I thought that was a great part of the book because I think it's important that obviously that other people can help working mums and mums to thrive in the workplace. That was the essence of that chapter, wasn't it?
Absolutely. There's this common phrase that everybody knows: it takes a village to raise a child. And I deeply believe that it takes a village to thrive in one's career. And obviously that working parenthood takes lots of different elements to support it. And I think people that support mothers in the workplace are critical. There's lots of research that shows that actually women coming back to the workplace are actually even more ambitious, but having the right structure and things in place actually will help those women and individuals thrive. I think it's absolutely necessary. One, if we want to make sure that we've got good diversity and good retention of our female workforce, those are just some of the reasons why I think it's really, really important. And so, I think in my career, people that have supported me, allies, people that don't necessarily have children or do have children that have been really supportive, have been absolutely critical. And there's lots of things I could say to allies, but I think not being afraid of this topic and maybe having a read of this book and just really leaning in and understanding that there's some really positive things that you can do. For example, one really small thing that you could do is, as somebody is going off on maternity leave, maybe have a think about not just, communicating that this person's going on maternity leave to your organization. Within that, obviously you need to do that. That's a practical step. But within that, maybe have a think about what value has that person added to the organization that you can also put within that piece of communication. So, for example, you could be sending an email saying, Tobi's going off on maternity leave, XYZ person's going to cover her role. But also I just want to thank Tobi because she's done 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10 number of wonderful things. I think that really helps cement that person's value in the organization. Other people also recognize that person's value before they go on maternity leave. But B, it's also really encouraging for the person going on maternity leave to know that they are valued within the workplace. But there's lots of tips within that chapter.
And mentioning there, actually, you've just reminded me of a point I wanted to bring up when you're saying about what the person had achieved in the workplace. Going back to the confidence part that we were just talking about, there's an exercise you write about in the book called the receipts exercise. If you just give an overview of that, because I thought that was really powerful.
Yeah, so just the same way that you go to a shop and you buy something and you have evidence of your purchase, I think it's the same way that we should make sure that we are recording evidence of the wonderful things that we've achieved on our career journey. And it should be an ongoing exercise, really, but I think it's really important to do it just before you go on maternity leave to remind yourself, again, of the wonderful things that you have achieved. And if you do have a wobble, a confidence wobble, a wobble is you're kind of going back to work and thinking, oh my goodness, can I really do this? Can I remember everything that I've done prior? Will people remember the good things that I've done? Have a look back at that receipt exercise. And I think even better if you can write it down in the book, because you can, maybe have a read of that chapter of confidence again and have a look back at the things that you've achieved to give you a little boost before you head back to work.
So Tobi, I mean, it's been fascinating. I read the book, but I also listened to it because it is on Audible. And so if you've enjoyed listening to Tobi talk about the book, I would recommend the Audible, actually, because the way the book's written, it's in a almost conversational way that it works really well as a book. And you read it yourself, don't you?
Yes, I do, yeah.
How long did that take, by the way?
Gosh, that took 2 days and 3/4, I would want to say. So just over 2.5 days. It was a lot of work. Way more work than I anticipated. But again, I've learned so much from this journey. So yeah, really interesting to do it.
Because when you listen to the audio, it's about 8 hours. That's how long the audio is as well. So I can imagine it must have taken you 2 days. And just to mention, if you do the Audible version of the book, the resources are actually attached as you can click on this. So there's like a PDF you can download. Yeah. So don't think you don't get the resources if you do the Audible version. So Tobi, thank you so much for coming on. Could you just give people a quick roundup where they can find you? So your social media and obviously your My Bump Pay website.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm at My Bump Pay, mainly on Instagram, and then the website is www.mybumppay.com, and then the book is available anywhere where you can buy a book.
So thank you, Tobi, for coming on. I really enjoyed it. I'm so glad that we eventually managed to make this happen. It's taken a long time, and it's brilliant it coincided with the release of your book. So congratulations on that. And as I say, thank you for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me and kind of going through the book and for reading it so quickly as well. You've done some good speed reading.
tell you there's a hint. One of the podcast listeners in the past told me that they listen to our podcast at twice speed. So I was able to do that with your audio book, and it sounds good. So look, it's interesting hearing you. Also, I've met you before, hearing you talking at normal speed, but I also know what you sound like at twice speed as well. So there you go. So thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much.
So there we go. There is the interview that Damien did with Tobi Asare. Make sure that you do check out My Bump Pay and also the fantastic book, The Blend. And so as Damien mentioned at the start of this podcast, you can win yourself a signed copy of that book. All you need to do is head to Instagram, find Money to the Masses, and you'll be able to see a post on there that will explain exactly how you can win yourself that signed copy. And so as we said at the start of this podcast, this is the first in a sort of mini series, if you like, of different types of podcasts looking at different content. You will see some more coming out in the coming weeks. And so if you have any content ideas that you'd like to see featured on the podcast, please do get in touch with us. It's Damien at moneytothemasses.com, Andy at moneytothemasses.com. We're always happy to hear your thoughts and comments. And so just to wrap up on this podcast then, please do, if you haven't already, review the podcast. You know how to do that already. 5-star reviews are what we prefer. It's always nice to see and read out a 5-star review. You can win yourself a Money to the Masses mug if we read that out on the podcast as well. And finally, just to mention our Facebook community group, do go and head over there if you haven't done so already. It's facebook.com/groups/Money to the Masses. So Damien, that's it. We're done for this week, aren't we?
We are. Until next time.
Until next time.